I am 38 years old, a senior vice president of global logistics earning a base salary of $315,000 with a performance bonus structure that usually pushes me past the $500,000 mark. Yet to my parents, I am still the invisible daughter who couldn't even manage to graduate from a local community college. They have spent the last 15 years telling everyone in our social circle in Lake Forest, Illinois, that I moved to a remote part of Oregon to join a commune and live off the grid because the truth, that I am a high-powered executive in Chicago who cut them off, is far more damaging to their carefully curated reputation than a daughter who simply went crazy. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the sweltering August afternoon in 2009, standing on the cracked driveway of our 5-bedroom Tudor-style home while my father, Marcus, loaded my sister Chloe's brand-new 2009 pearl white Lexus IS 250 with designer luggage for her move into the University of Chicago dorms. I was standing there holding a single cardboard box containing my few possessions, and as the engine of that $38,000 car purred to life, my father looked at me with a cold, dismissive sneer and handed me a crumpled $20 bill. "This is the last cent of my hard-earned money you will ever see, Elena," he said, his voice devoid of any paternal warmth. "Since you decided to throw your life away by refusing to study law like your sister, you can find your own way to the bus station. Don't bother coming back for Thanksgiving. We've already told the neighbors you've decided to travel abroad to find yourself." The golden child dynamic in the Vance household was less of a preference and more of a religious dogma. Chloe, 2 years my junior, was the living embodiment of my parents' vanity. While I spent my high school years working 30 hours a week at a local Jewel-Osco grocery store for $8.25 an hour just to save for a beat-up 1998 Honda Civic, Chloe was gifted a tiered allowance of $500 a month for social maintenance. My mother, Evelyn, a woman who measured her self-worth by the thread count of her fret linens and the vintage of the Chardonnay she served at her garden club meetings, treated my existence like a persistent stain on an otherwise perfect rug. I remember the smell of her expensive Jo Malone lime basil and mandarin perfume filling the hallway as she walked past my room, never stopping to ask about my day, only pausing to criticize the industrial scent of my work uniform. The disparity was surgical. When Chloe broke a vase, it was an artistic accident. When I slipped on the ice and bruised my ribs, I was told I was being dramatic and seeking attention. I learned early on that my value in that house was exactly zero, so I started building a world where their validation wasn't the currency I traded in. I didn't go to a commune. I walked 3 miles to the metro station, took the train into the city, and checked into a $45 a night hostel in River North that smelled of stale beer and desperation. I worked 3 jobs: a morning shift as a barista at a Starbucks on Wacker Drive, an afternoon stint as a filing clerk for a mid-sized law firm where I watched girls like Chloe act entitled to the air they breathed, and a night shift cleaning office buildings in the Loop. My hands were permanently stained with the scent of industrial bleach and espresso grounds. I lived on 99-cent boxes of Barilla pasta and tap water for 3 years while I put myself through a night program for supply chain management. I remember sitting in a cramped library at 2 a.m., my eyes burning from the fluorescent lights, calculating the shipping logistics for a hypothetical fleet of cargo ships while my sister was posting photos from a $12,000 spring break trip to Cabo San Lucas that my father had gleefully financed. They never called. Not once. They didn't even send a generic card when I graduated at the top of my class. In their minds, Elena Vance had ceased to exist the moment she stopped being a useful accessory to their social standing. Today, I live in a 2,800-square-foot penthouse in the West Loop with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlook the very skyscrapers I used to clean at 3 in the morning. I drive a 2024 deep-sea blue Audi RS e-tron GT that cost me $147,000 cash, and my kitchen is stocked with the kind of high-end organic produce my mother used to flaunt like a status symbol. I am the person who decides which cargo ships move across the Atlantic and which logistical hubs receive multi-million-dollar investments. I built this empire out of the dirt they rubbed my face in. But the most satisfying part isn't the money or the title. It's the silence. For 15 years I have been a ghost to them, a self-imposed exile that allowed me to heal. However, ghosts have a way of reappearing when the people who buried them suddenly find themselves in need of a miracle. Last Tuesday, a formal invitation arrived at my office, not my home because they don't have that address, addressed to the Vice President of Logistics. My parents are hosting a gala to save my father's failing manufacturing plant, And they have no idea that the anonymous donor they've been begging for a meeting with is the daughter they discarded for the price of a $20 bill and a lie. Family isn't the people who share your DNA. It's the people who wouldn't dream of letting you walk to a bus station alone in the rain. My name is Caspian, and at 34 years old I am a senior financial intelligence analyst with a top-secret clearance and a 145 IQ, pulling in a base salary of $185,000 before federal bonuses. Yet in the eyes of my family, I am nothing more than a low-level cubicle drone who failed to meet the Webster standard of excellence. I spend my days tracking international money laundering schemes and identifying high-level financial threats for the government, moving millions of dollars across digital borders with a single keystroke. But when I walk into my parents' mahogany-paneled dining room in Alexandria, Virginia, I am instantly demoted to the family disappointment. The air in that house always smells of expensive beeswax polish and my mother's suffocating Jo Malone peony and blush suede perfume, a scent that marks the territory of a lifestyle I supposedly couldn't hack. My sister Sloane is the undisputed sun around which my parents' universe rotates, a 36-year-old lifestyle influencer, whose entire existence is a carefully curated lie financed by the very people she looks down upon. She stands there in her $1,200 Zimmermann silk wrap dress, sipping a vintage Krug champagne that costs $250 a bottle, while I am expected to sit in the corner and stay silent so as not to disturb the aesthetic of their perfect family portraits. The moment that shattered the last of my patience happened during my father's retirement gala, an event that cost upward of $15,000 at the local country club, where the elite of the military and political world gathered to toast a man who hadn't spoken a kind word to me in 20 years. I was standing near the buffet line holding a lukewarm glass of sparkling water, when Sloane approached me with that familiar predatory glint in her eyes. The photographers were circling, their $6,000 Canon EOS R3 cameras clicking rhythmically, capturing the royal family of Alexandria in their natural habitat. As the lens swung toward us, Sloane leaned in, the sharp scent of her third martini hitting me like a physical blow, and gripped my forearm so hard her manicured nails, painted in a shade called Rich Girl Nude, left 4 deep crescent-shaped marks on my skin. She hissed at me to get out of the frame because my face was ruining the entire family's aesthetic, telling me to stand where I wasn't seen so no one would realize what a failure I was. My father, Richard, stood 5 feet away in his dress blues, his chest heavy with medals he earned while I was home alone teaching myself advanced calculus, and he didn't even blink as his favorite child humiliated me in front of the Undersecretary of Defense. They truly believe I spend my life filing papers in a windowless basement, but the reality is that I live in a $1.2 million industrial loft in Logan Circle with a view of the Washington Monument that would make my father's blood pressure spike. I drive a 2024 sapphire blue Porsche Taycan Turbo S that I paid for in cash, a vehicle that represents more technical sophistication in its door handle than Sloane has in her entire body. While they were busy praising Sloane for hitting 100,000 followers on an app, I was busy deconstructing a $112,320 trust fund that our grandmother had left for my master's degree in quantitative finance. A fund that had mysteriously dwindled to exactly $4.12 over the last 18 months. My father had entrusted Sloane with the secondary signatory rights because he believed her business sense was superior to my clerical mind. He didn't realize that his golden daughter had been using that money to lease her white Range Rover and buy fake engagement with bot farms in Eastern Europe. I sat in my home office last night, the glow of my triple monitor setup reflecting off my glasses, and watched the digital trail of her theft unfold like a roadmap to her destruction. Every $5,000 marketing expense she withdrew was a nail in the coffin of her reputation, and as a man who specializes in financial warfare, I know exactly when to strike for maximum impact. Family isn't about who shares your last name or who looks best in a filtered photo. It's about who doesn't stab you in the dark while smiling for the camera. The air in my father's study was thick with the suffocating scent of stale Macanudo cigar smoke and the sharp medicinal sting of a $300 bottle of Glenmorangie Signet Scotch that sat half-empty on his desk. Richard Webster stood there in his perfectly pressed charcoal suit, the overhead library lights catching the polished bezel of his $7,000 Breitling Navitimer as he leaned over the heavy mahogany surface like a commander preparing for an execution. My father, the man who spent 30 years in the military demanding absolute loyalty, was currently orchestrating the ultimate betrayal by sliding a cold, white power of attorney document across the desk toward me. He didn't ask, he demanded that I sign over the remaining $28,000 of my personal savings, money I had painstakingly hoarded by working 18-hour days and eating $2 ramen packs in my cramped studio, to my sister's fiancé, Julian. Julian was a man who wore $900 Gucci loafers without socks and claimed to be an angel investor. But I knew from my internal clearance checks that he was nothing more than a high-end grifter looking for his next mark. When I looked my father in the eye and refused to sign, the silence in the room became a physical weight, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that cost more than my entire education. Richard's face turned a mottled shade of purple before he slammed his fist onto the desk with such violence that the crystal Scotch decanter rattled against its silver tray, and he bellowed that I had no future worth investing in and that I should give the money to someone who actually mattered. Sloane was leaning against the doorframe, a picture of manufactured elegance in her $800 Aritzia coat, lazily swirling a $14 glass of buttery Chardonnay as she watched my world collapse with a look of bored amusement. She didn't say a word, but her smile was a jagged blade, a silent confirmation that she had already poisoned the well and convinced our parents that my refusal was an act of petty jealousy rather than financial survival. As I stood there in my $40 button-down shirt from Target, feeling the heat of my father's contempt, I realized that I wasn't just being asked for money. I was being evicted from the family heart in a calculated move to subsidize Sloane's delusions of grandeur. The contrast was nauseating, seeing my father protect a parasite like Julian while he treated his own son's hard-earned security like pocket change to be tossed into a fire. I could feel the 4 crescent-shaped marks Sloane had left on my arm earlier throbbing in time with my heartbeat, a physical reminder of the aesthetic I was supposedly ruining. I looked at the $28,000 figure on the paper, thinking of the 450-square-foot apartment where the heater rattled all night and the 2012 Ford Focus with the dented fender that groaned every time I turned the key, and then I looked at the man who called himself my father. He wasn't looking at a son, he was looking at an obstacle to his favorite child's comfort. I didn't sign the paper, and as I turned to walk out of that room, leaving the scent of expensive tobacco and betrayal behind me, I knew that the bridge wasn't just burned, it was vaporized. They thought they were taking my past, but they had no idea I was already holding the keys to their financial future, and the background noise of the Webster family was about to become a deafening roar. Family isn't a blood oath that justifies theft. It's a bond that should protect you from it, and that night the bond was officially dead. The heavy silence of my father's study followed me like a physical weight as I descended the grand staircase of the Webster estate, my footsteps muffled by the $12,000 Persian runner that spanned the marble foyer. But the moment I stepped out into the humid Virginia night, the reality of my exile hit me with the force of a tidal wave. I didn't head back to my cramped studio in Alexandria immediately. Instead, I found myself pulling my dented 2012 Ford Focus into the gravel lot of a 24-hour diner called the Greasy Spoon at exactly 3:14 a.m., a time when the world feels thin and the only people awake are those with too much on their minds or nothing left to lose. The diner was a relic of chrome and cracked vinyl, illuminated by flickering fluorescent tubes that hummed with a low-frequency buzz that vibrated in my very teeth, and the air inside was a thick soup of burnt Arabica beans and industrial-strength floor cleaner. I slid into a corner booth where the red Naugatuck leather was held together by silver duct tape, and as a waitress with a faded name tag brought me a chipped ceramic mug of coffee that tasted like battery acid, I spread a thin, cheap paper napkin across the Formica tabletop. I pulled a black Uniball Onyx pen from my pocket and began to map out the financial architecture of the Webster family with the cold, detached precision of a man who tracks international money laundering for a living. As I drew the flow chart, connecting my father's manufacturing assets to Sloane's inflated influencer expenses and Julian's murky shell companies, the horrifying truth began to crystallize under the harsh yellow light of the diner. They weren't just asking for my $28,000 to fund a high-level investment. They were attempting to use my Tier 1 credit score and my clean, government-vetted financial history as a pristine anchor for a series of fraudulent offshore accounts Julian was setting up in the Cayman Islands. My father, the decorated colonel who prided himself on integrity, was either too blinded by his devotion to Sloane to see the crime, or he was a willing participant in a scheme that would have seen me serving 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary while they sipped cocktails on a yacht. I looked at my reflection in the dark, grease-streaked window of the diner, barely recognizing the man staring back. A man who had spent a decade playing the role of the humble background noise while his family sharpened their knives. My 145 IQ, which I usually applied to protecting national interests, suddenly pivoted with a predatory snap toward the people who shared my DNA but possessed none of my loyalty. I realized in that moment that I was done being the safety net for a family that viewed my survival as an inconvenience to their aesthetic. And as I watched a lone raindrop streak down the glass, I made a cold, calculated choice to stop being the prey. I was no longer the cubicle drone they mocked. I was a senior financial intelligence analyst who knew exactly which threads to pull to make their entire $4.5 million empire unravel into a heap of legal filings and frozen assets. I reached into my bag, pulled out my encrypted government-issued laptop, and felt the familiar weight of the magnesium chassis as the boot screen illuminated my face in a pale digital blue. The transition was absolute. A shift in my internal chemistry that replaced my lingering hurt with a crystalline surgical focus. Family is supposed to be the harbor you return to when the storm gets too rough. But when the harbor itself tries to sink your ship for the insurance money, you don't just leave. You burn the dock so they can never hurt anyone else again. I took a final sip of the bitter coffee, closed my eyes for a heartbeat to mourn the brother I used to be, and then I began to type, the rhythmic clicking of the keys sounding like a countdown to the end of the Webster legacy. For the next 14 days, I lived in a state of cold, clinical detachment, functioning on 4 hours of sleep and the kind of adrenaline that only comes from knowing you are about to dismantle a legacy built on a foundation of lies. I spent my nights and early mornings at my secure terminal in the Financial Intelligence Unit, the hum of the cooling fans providing a steady white noise as I navigated through layers of encrypted data that would have baffled a standard forensic accountant. My clearance allowed me to pull 48 months of granular bank records across 3 different institutions, and as I filtered the transactions, a chilling pattern emerged from the digital noise. 16 suspicious wire transfers, each for the exact amount of $2,340, moving from my grandmother's trust into a shell company registered in Julian's name. It wasn't just petty theft or the indulgence of a spoiled sister. It was a sophisticated layering technique designed to bypass automated fraud alerts by staying just under the threshold of typical red-flagged amounts. I watched the cursor blink on my screen, reflecting in my glasses as I uncovered the most damning piece of the puzzle. Julian wasn't just a social climber, he was a federal liability who was selling refurbished, substandard radar components to mid-tier defense contractors under the guise of new military-grade hardware. The weight of the betrayal felt like a physical pressure in my chest as I realized that my father, the great Colonel Richard Webster, had likely used his remaining military connections to facilitate these meetings, effectively tying his own reputation to a treasonous enterprise. Every time I hit the print command, the rhythmic whirring of the laser printer felt like a gavel striking a desk, producing page after page of forensic audits and encrypted email chains that stripped away the veneer of the golden child and her charming fiancé. I found a specific thread of messages from Sloane where she openly bragged to her friends about bleeding the nerd dry, referring to me as a convenient ATM that didn't know how to say no, her words immortalized in timestamped screenshots that I pinned to the inside of a thick, heavy manila folder. I organized the evidence with the same meticulous care I used for high-level government briefings, separating the financial fraud from the military procurement violations with color-coded tabs that shimmered under my desk lamp. My 2012 Ford Focus sat in the driveway of my studio apartment, its dented fender a constant reminder of the life they thought I deserved, while I sat inside with a $4.5 million bombshell ready to detonate in my hands. I spent my lunch break sitting in my Porsche, which I still kept hidden 3 blocks away in a rented garage, reviewing the statutes for federal wire fraud and the False Claims Act, knowing that once I initiated this sequence, there would be no retreating to the safety of the background noise. I could almost smell the expensive scotch and cigar smoke from my father's study as I tucked the final report into the folder, a document that detailed how Julian had redirected $112,320 of my inheritance to fund Sloane's bot-fueled social media growth and their upcoming $200,000 wedding at the St. Regis. I wasn't just a brother or a son anymore. I was a predator who had spent 14 days sharpening my teeth on their arrogance and their digital footprints. Family is supposed to be a sanctuary of trust, but when that trust is traded for refurbished radar parts and designer shoes, the only logical response is a total and scorched earth audit. I closed the manila folder with a sharp final click of the brass fastener, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over me as I realized that for the first time in 34 years, I was the one holding the rank. I stood near the edge of the ballroom where the chandeliers spilled gold light over polished marble, watching the performance unfold with the kind of stillness that only comes from certainty, the certainty that every second ticking forward was bringing everything closer to collapse. And while laughter echoed and glasses clinked, I kept one hand on the folder tucked beneath my arm as if it were the only real thing in a room built entirely on illusion. The air smelled like expensive perfume and aged whiskey, the kind poured carelessly tonight as if wealth itself had no limit, and I noticed how people leaned in too close to each other, smiling too wide, speaking just a little too loudly, all of them feeding off the spectacle, unaware that the foundation beneath their polished shoes was already cracking. I watched the stage where the speeches would happen, where carefully crafted words would be delivered with rehearsed sincerity, and I felt nothing resembling nerves, only a quiet, controlled anticipation that settled deep in my chest like a weight I had grown used to carrying. When the lights dimmed slightly and the room shifted its attention forward, I knew the moment had begun, and as the first toast started, full of admiration and hollow praise, I let my eyes move slowly across the crowd, recognizing faces that had once mattered, people who had chosen convenience over truth, who had smiled while signing things they never bothered to read, who had trusted a narrative because it benefited them to do so. Every word spoken on that stage felt like a lie layered over another lie, polished and presented as something admirable, and I could almost admire the precision of it, the way everything had been constructed so flawlessly that no one questioned it. No one even considered that the entire story could unravel in a matter of minutes. I shifted my stance slightly, adjusting the sleeve of my suit, feeling the fabric pull tight across my shoulders like a reminder of why I was here. And when the applause rose again, louder this time, I took a slow breath and stepped away from the wall, moving through the crowd with deliberate calm, each step measured, each movement controlled, as if I were simply another guest drawn closer by the celebration. But I wasn't drawn by celebration, I was drawn by timing, and as I approached the center of the room, I could see the faces more clearly now, the confidence, the arrogance, the absolute certainty that tonight was a victory, and I felt a faint, almost imperceptible shift inside me, not doubt, not hesitation, but the final alignment of intention and action. The folder felt heavier now, not because of its contents but because of what it represented, proof distilled into paper, undeniable, irreversible, and I knew that once it was opened, once those pages were seen under the same lights that now illuminated champagne glasses and forced smiles, nothing in this room would remain untouched. Another round of applause echoed, signaling the transition to the final speech, the one that would seal the illusion, and I moved closer still, close enough to hear every word clearly, close enough that when the moment came, there would be no barrier, no delay, nothing to soften the impact of what was about to happen. I didn't rush, I didn't hesitate, I simply waited, because patience had brought me this far, and patience would make what came next unavoidable, undeniable, and permanent. As the speech began, polished and rehearsed, filled with carefully chosen gratitude that rang hollow the moment it left her mouth, I stepped forward without hesitation and walked onto the stage, my shoes striking the floor with a steady, deliberate rhythm that cut through the soft hum of the room until the sound itself seemed to demand attention. And one by one conversations died, forks paused midair, and the entire ballroom turned toward me in a silence so complete it felt engineered. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't need to, because I had learned long ago that authority was never about volume but about control, and when I spoke I used the same tone reserved for briefings where mistakes carried consequences, calm and precise, each word placed exactly where it needed to land, leaving no room for interruption or dismissal. Without looking away from the crowd, I signaled to the technician, and the massive screen behind me flickered before resolving into a clean, undeniable image. A series of numbers and transaction logs that meant nothing to most at first glance but carried enough structure to demand attention. And then I spoke again, outlining the exact figure, $112,320, taken from a trust that had been built on trust in more ways than one, and as the number settled into the room, I watched understanding begin to spread, slow at first, then all at once. The shift was immediate and irreversible, like a fracture running through glass, and I could see it in their faces, the subtle tightening around the eyes, the sudden stillness of people who had just realized they were no longer witnessing a celebration but something far less comfortable, something real. I advanced the slide with a small, controlled motion, revealing the next layer, the federal flags attached to accounts that had been presented as visionary success. And this time I didn't need to explain as much, because the words alone carried weight, enough to ripple through the room with a quiet, building tension that replaced the earlier warmth entirely. Somewhere to my left, the sharp metallic crack of a silver fork hitting the floor broke the silence, louder than it should have been, and I turned my head just enough to register the source. An investor whose confidence had visibly drained in an instant, his expression no longer composed but calculating, already distancing himself from what he now understood to be a liability. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make the moment settle, to ensure that no one could pretend they hadn't seen or heard, and then I reached for the folder, the same one I had carried through the room like a quiet promise, and stepped down from the stage with the same measured control, crossing the short distance to the head of security. I placed the folder in his hands without ceremony, meeting his eyes briefly, recognizing in his posture the shift from passive oversight to active responsibility, and I knew he understood exactly what he had just been given, not speculation, not accusation, but documentation that demanded action. When I turned back toward the room, the illusion had already begun to collapse, not with chaos or shouting, but with something far more decisive, the collective realization that the narrative they had accepted so easily had just been dismantled in front of them, piece by piece, with nothing left to hide behind. The execution was precise to the point of feeling almost detached, as if every movement and every word had been rehearsed not for drama but for impact. And when I lifted the microphone again, the weight of the room had already shifted so completely that even the smallest sound carried, even a breath felt amplified, and I let that silence hold for just a fraction longer before I spoke. I addressed him directly, not loudly, not with anger, but with the same measured clarity that had guided every step leading here, stating that the black card he had tried to use 10 minutes earlier had not failed because of any technical error, not because of some harmless glitch that could be laughed off and forgotten, but because I had already set the process in motion hours before, initiating a Tier 1 financial freeze through the Treasury Department, a decision that now existed beyond anyone. In that room, beyond negotiation, beyond reversal. The words didn't need emphasis because their meaning carried its own force, and I watched as the realization landed, not just on him but across the faces surrounding him, a ripple of comprehension that turned confidence into something brittle and uncertain, and when I shifted my gaze, I saw her expression collapse in a way that felt almost unreal, the color draining so completely from her face that it reminded me of something clinical, something I had only ever seen in places where shock replaced emotion entirely. There was movement to my right, sudden and unsteady, as another figure attempted to rise, perhaps to interrupt, perhaps to regain control of a situation that had already slipped beyond reach. But the effort failed almost immediately, legs giving out under the weight of the moment, turning what might have been defiance into something closer to exposure. I didn't react to it, didn't acknowledge the disruption because it no longer mattered, and instead I turned back toward the audience, toward the dozens of witnesses who had come expecting spectacle of a different kind, and I let my eyes move across them slowly, deliberately, making sure there was no corner of the room untouched by what was being said. Then I spoke again, and this time the statement was broader, not directed at any single person but at the entire construct they had been admiring all evening, explaining with the same controlled tone that the aesthetic they had celebrated, the image they had invested in, the narrative they had helped sustain, was built on fraud from its foundation upward, not a misstep, not an oversight, but a structure designed to deceive. I paused only briefly before adding the final detail, delivered without flourish, without threat, simply as fact, telling them to enjoy what remained of the evening because federal agents were already in the lobby, and as the words settled I could feel the shift complete, the transformation from curated elegance to something far more fragile, a room no longer held together by illusion but by the undeniable presence of consequence. The fallout didn't come as chaos in a single moment but as a controlled demolition that unfolded with relentless precision over the next 72 hours. Each development landing with the kind of finality that left no room for denial, and I watched it all from a distance, not intervening, not reacting, because everything that followed was simply the system doing what it was designed to do once the truth had been forced into the open. By the second day he was no longer moving freely through curated spaces or speaking in confident, rehearsed tones, but instead sitting under questioning, his narrative stripped down to answers that no longer carried authority, as federal investigators pressed into areas that had once been hidden behind layers of confidence and carefully constructed legitimacy, and the mention of ITR violations alone was enough to shift the tone from speculation to something far more severe, something that carried consequences extending well beyond financial damage. At the same time, the unraveling took on a more visible, almost symbolic form in the hotel parking lot, where the vehicle that had once represented status and control was taken back without ceremony, hooked and removed under the indifferent gaze of a system that doesn't pause for emotion. And I saw her through the glass of the lobby, still caught in the aftermath, still trying to process a reality that had shifted too quickly to grasp, her composure gone, replaced by something raw and uncontained that drew quiet attention from those passing by but no intervention. What had once been presented as unshakable wealth and influence was reduced in hours to a series of recoveries, seizures and legal motions, each one documented, each one public, each one erasing another layer of the image they had worked so hard to maintain. And there was a certain inevitability to it that made the entire process feel less like punishment and more like exposure finally catching up with illusion. The most profound shift, though, came not from the legal actions or the financial losses, but from the collapse of reputation, the kind that cannot be repaired once it fractures at its core. And when the local papers began publishing the details, connecting names to actions, framing everything in clear, undeniable language, I saw the final piece fall into place. The narrative that had once been built on discipline, service, and honor was replaced with one rooted in deception and exploitation. And there was no defense against it because the evidence spoke louder than any statement ever could, leaving him with no choice but to liquidate what remained, the estate that had once stood as a symbol of legacy reduced to an asset to be sold, not for growth or ambition, but simply to keep pace with the mounting legal costs that now defined his reality. I didn't feel satisfaction watching it happen, only a quiet acknowledgement that this was the natural end of something that had been allowed to exist unchecked for too long. And as each piece fell away, what remained was not ruin for its own sake, but the absence of the illusion that had once made everything seem untouchable. The voicemail came through late, the kind that fills the silence of a room even before it finishes playing, 6 full minutes of uneven breathing and breaking words that tried to stitch together an argument out of emotion, repeating the same phrase about family loyalty as if saying it enough times could turn it into something binding again. Something that could override everything that had already happened, and I listened to it once all the way through, without interrupting it, without reacting, letting every second of it settle into a clarity that only confirmed what I already understood. There was no hesitation when it ended, no instinct to respond, no pull toward reconciliation, because whatever that word had once meant had already been dismantled piece by piece, long before that message was recorded. And calling back would have meant stepping back into a narrative that had already proven itself hollow. Instead, I chose something deliberate, something structured, something that carried weight beyond emotion, and I went to my attorney's office, a place that felt intentionally removed from everything else, where the air carried the scent of polished leather and aging paper, where every detail reinforced the idea of permanence and consequence. And I sat across from her as I laid out exactly what needed to be done. She didn't ask unnecessary questions, didn't offer commentary beyond what was required, because she understood the nature of the situation from the documents alone, from the pattern they revealed, and together we shaped the response into something precise, a formal cease and desist that left no ambiguity, no room for reinterpretation or emotional appeal. The language was controlled, exact, stating clearly that there would be no further contact of any kind, no calls, no messages, no attempts to re-establish connection through any channel, and that any violation of those terms would trigger the immediate release of additional material, documentation that had not yet been made public, evidence that extended beyond what had already surfaced and into areas that would carry even heavier consequences. I reviewed it once before it was sent, not to reconsider, but to confirm that every word aligned with the outcome I intended, and when I gave the approval, it was dispatched without delay, moving through the proper channels with the same quiet efficiency that had defined everything else up to that point. There was no sense of closure in that moment, no dramatic finality, just a clean separation enforced through structure rather than sentiment. And as I left the office, the world outside felt unchanged, indifferent even, as if none of it had mattered beyond the boundaries I had drawn, which was exactly the point. Now I live high above the noise, in a space that feels deliberately stripped of everything that once defined my life. A high-rise apartment with glass stretching from floor to ceiling where the city unfolds beneath me in quiet, distant motion. And there is a clarity in knowing that every inch of it, every object, every line of sight, exists without compromise, without anything taken or concealed, built entirely on what I chose to earn and keep. The silence here is different from the kind I used to know, not tense or waiting to be broken, but steady and complete, the kind that allows thoughts to settle without interruption, and I've come to recognize that as something far more valuable than anything that was ever displayed in crowded rooms filled with performance and pretense. There are no unnecessary excesses, no curated displays meant to impress anyone else, only what serves a purpose or holds meaning, and among those things is the telescope I placed near the window, a deliberate purchase that cost more than practicality would justify, yet felt necessary in a way I didn't need to explain to anyone. I remember the dismissal that once followed any interest in something like this, the casual way it was labeled as pointless, as if value could only exist in what was immediately profitable or visible. And standing here now, adjusting the lens with careful precision, I understand how narrow that perspective was, how limited it made everything appear. When I look through it, the city disappears, replaced by something far more expansive and indifferent points of light that have existed long before any of this and will continue long after, and there is a certain grounding in that scale, a recalibration that strips everything down to proportion. All the noise, all the conflict, all the carefully constructed facades that once demanded attention now feel distant to the point of irrelevance, reduced to something so small it barely registers, like dust suspended in a beam of light, visible only if you go looking for it. I don't think about it the way I used to, not with tension or urgency, but with a kind of detachment that comes from distance, both physical and otherwise, and as I stand there steadying the focus and letting the image sharpen, I recognize that what I have now isn't just separation, it's perspective, something that couldn't have existed without everything that came before but no longer depends on it in any way. I am no longer the person standing at the edge of someone else's narrative, reduced to a background detail in a carefully edited image that was never meant to include me in any meaningful way, and there is a clarity in recognizing that I didn't step out of that frame by accident. I removed it entirely, cut it cleanly from my life with the same precision that defined every other decision that brought me here. There was a time when their perception carried weight, when being dismissed or diminished felt like something I had to either endure or somehow earn my way out of. But that illusion dissolved the moment I understood that their version of me was never rooted in truth, only in what was convenient for them to believe, and once that became undeniable, there was nothing left to negotiate. I've heard what became of her, the quiet downgrade from curated appearances and effortless superiority to something far more ordinary, a position that pays by the hour, grounded in the same reality she once treated with open contempt. And there is an irony in that shift that doesn't need commentary, because it exists on its own, complete and self-explanatory. What matters more is where I stand now, not in comparison, not as a reaction but as a result of decisions made without compromise. And the promotion didn't come as validation from them or anyone connected to that past. It came from a system that recognized consistency, discipline, and results, things that were never acknowledged in the environment I left behind but were always there, waiting to be applied somewhere that actually measured them correctly. The title itself is almost secondary to what it represents, a shift from being overlooked to being responsible, from being underestimated to being relied upon, and there is a certain weight to that responsibility that I accept without hesitation because it was built, not given, shaped through choices that required distance, clarity, and the willingness to walk away when staying would have meant shrinking. Looking back, I don't see a dramatic transformation or a single defining moment. I see a series of deliberate actions that rewrote the structure of my life piece by piece, removing what didn't belong, reinforcing what did, until the version that exists now feels entirely my own, not influenced by expectation or constrained by anyone else's narrative. There is no need to revisit what was left behind, no lingering attachment to the roles that were assigned to me, because those roles no longer exist in any context that matters. And what replaced them is not just independence, but authorship, the ability to define direction without interference, to exist without being edited, reduced, or repositioned to fit someone else's frame.